I spent Thanksgiving night at my parents' house for dinner, as they were hosting this year. It was a typical family gathering, with my cousins and uncles, some of whom I hadn't seen in almost a year, coming together. But before we even sat down for dinner, I received a long text from an unknown number. The message, filled with personal and revealing details, began with, "Hey Melissa, hope your Thanksgiving is going well." It didn't take long for me to realize who had sent it. It was Kevin, a guy who I had never met in person but who had become a dangerous stalker. Kevin and I had matched on a dating app some time ago. We texted and snapped each other for a while, but we never actually met. It was clear from the beginning that he was obsessive. When I politely declined to go on a date with him, explaining that I didn't think we had much in common, his behavior became more disturbing. He grew more aggressive, and even threatened me when I posted a Snapchat story of me having drinks with a friend, mistakenly assuming I was on a date with another guy. That's when I blocked him on every platform: Snapchat, Instagram, and even his phone number. Despite my efforts, the harassment didn't stop. I started receiving follow requests on Instagram from random accounts with 0 followers, and I would block each one. The same thing happened on Snapchat, where I would get friend requests from profiles with strange usernames and no activity. When I would add them back out of curiosity, their snap scores were always 0, making it clear they were new accounts created just to contact me. The message Kevin sent on Thanksgiving was unsettling. He tried to manipulate and gaslight me, and there were hints of threats in his words. I replied to him firmly, warning him to stop contacting me or I would go to the police. It took me a while to compose my response, which irritated my grandmother, who asked me to put my phone away so I could focus on the family. I did my best to brush it off, but about half an hour later, I received another text from a different random number. This time, the message was even longer and more disturbing, filled with insults and accusations. Kevin's behavior had escalated, and it was clear that he had no intention of leaving me alone. I didn't want to let it ruin my evening, so I tried to stay present with my family. But when things started winding down and people began to leave, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I showed my family the texts, and they were horrified. My mom insisted that I report Kevin to the police the next day for harassment, and I agreed that it was the right thing to do. Later that night, I returned to my apartment. I live in the lower floor of a 2-family house with my roommate Chelsea. She wasn't home yet, so I went straight to my room to unwind. I decided to find a Christmas movie to watch to help me relax. As I was browsing, my phone rang. The caller ID said unknown, and I immediately knew it was Kevin. I declined the call and silenced my phone, hoping to distance myself from the stress. I put on a Christmas movie, Surviving Christmas, and started to doze off about halfway through. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. It was late, so I assumed it was Chelsea coming home from her family gathering. The footsteps came right up to my door, and then someone tried to open it. Thankfully, I always lock my bedroom door at night, even though I trust Chelsea. It's just a habit I have. I paused the movie and listened as the doorknob turned a few more times. I called out, "Chelsea?" But there was no response. The footsteps quietly retreated down the hallway. I grabbed my phone to call Chelsea, but when I looked at the screen, I saw a series of texts from yet another random number. One of them read, "Good thing you made it obvious where you live." Panic washed over me. I tried calling Chelsea multiple times, but she didn't answer. In a state of fear, I called my parents. My dad picked up, and I whispered into the phone that I thought Kevin had broken into my apartment. My dad told me to stay put, and that he was coming over right away. Even though my parents lived just 10 minutes away, my dad made it to my apartment in 5 minutes. That's how fast he drove. During the time I waited for him to arrive, I stayed on the phone with him the entire time, my heart racing. Chelsea finally called me back, and I asked her if she had come home earlier. That's when she told me that she wasn't coming back to the apartment that night. My fear was confirmed. The person outside my door was not her. When my dad arrived, the front door was still locked. I let him in, and we searched the apartment from top to bottom. At first, we didn't find anything unusual, but then my dad noticed that the sliding window by the kitchen was unlocked. The window was big enough for someone to climb through. He looked at me with disappointment and scolded me for not locking the window. That's how Kevin had gotten in. I packed a bag and went back to my parents' house to sleep that night. The next morning, my dad took me to the county courthouse, where we were given step-by-step instructions on how to obtain a temporary restraining order. Over the next few weeks, I went through the legal process, and eventually, I had to see Kevin in person when the restraining order was extended. The judge granted the extension based on Kevin's threatening texts, though I couldn't prove that he had broken into my apartment. The restraining order made it clear that if Kevin ever tried to contact me again, he would be arrested. This whole experience was terrifying. and I can only hope that Kevin hasn't found another person to torment. I grew up in a small town in central Arkansas, and every year, when deer season rolled around in November, my family and I would make our way to our hunting cabin near Mena, Arkansas. The cabin holds a lot of memories for us. It was built by my great-grandfather in 1984. Though it's a bit outdated by today's standards, it's more than enough for what we need. It's a simple structure, but it has a certain charm, especially when the cold season hits and the woods surrounding it become alive with the sounds of wildlife. Over the years, it became a gathering place for my family and friends to hunt, unwind, and escape the world for a while. 2 years ago, in late October, I decided to invite my friends Austin and Cody to join me for a pre-season hunt. We were there for muzzleloading season, which is like a warm-up for the main hunting season where we use muzzleloaders to hunt deer. It's a bit more of a challenge compared to modern firearms, but that's part of the appeal. We were scouting a new area about a mile from the cabin, looking for signs of deer activity and trying to figure out where to set up our stands for the upcoming modern gun season. The woods around Mena are thick and dense in some places, which makes finding the perfect spot for a stand both tricky and rewarding. After splitting up to cover more ground, we wandered through the woods for a while, searching for an area with good sight lines. While walking alone, I came across something I wasn't expecting to find. A pile of rocks, arranged in a way that looked intentional. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was actually a grave. The name on the weathered marker read, Ed Crane. It caught me off guard, but I wasn't really frightened, more intrigued than anything. Who was Ed Crane? What was his story? My friends and I snapped a couple of pictures of the grave, figuring we'd look into it later, and after finding a good spot for the stand, we headed back to the cabin. Back at the cabin, Cody tried to do some research on Ed Crane, hoping to find out more about the grave we had stumbled upon. However, he didn't come up with much. The mystery of Ed Crane lingered in the back of our minds, but we didn't dwell on it too long. We were more focused on the upcoming modern gun season, which was just a few weeks away. 3 weeks later, Austin and I returned to the cabin for the official start of modern gun season. This time, it was just the two of us. Cody couldn't make it. The night before opening day, we sat in the cabin going over our plan for the hunt. Austin decided to head toward a small lake off the property, about 1.5 miles from the cabin, while I opted to hunt near the stand we had set up during the muzzleloading season, not far from the old grave. I left the cabin around 4:45 a.m., wanting to give myself plenty of time to walk the 1.5 miles to the stand. The early morning walk was nothing out of the ordinary for me. I'd been hunting these woods since I was 9, so I knew them well. The path was quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot and the sounds of the woods waking up. The air was crisp, and there was a thin layer of fog clinging to the ground, giving the landscape an eerie yet familiar feel. When I reached the stand, I settled in, trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to spook any deer that might be nearby. As the sun slowly started to rise, I couldn't help but glance over toward the grave we had found weeks earlier. It was about 30 yards away, partially hidden by the surrounding brush. In the dim morning light, I could just make out the mound of rocks through the leaves. That's when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, just to the left of my vision. At first, it didn't alarm me. It's common to see movement in the early morning while hunting. In fact, it usually means deer are nearby, which is always exciting. I turned my head fully to the left, expecting to catch sight of whatever it was. But there was nothing there. Just as I started to brush it off, I heard something. A faint, almost whispered scream from behind me. It said, "Hey." The voice startled me so badly I physically jumped, shaking the entire stand. My heart raced as I whipped my head around, looking for the source of the sound, but I saw nothing. The woods behind me were empty. I reached for my headlamp, quickly turning it on and scanning the area. For a good 5 to 6 minutes, I panned my light over the trees and brush, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I was still shaking as I grabbed my hand radio and called out to Austin, asking if he was anywhere near me. There was no response. I kept calling, all while nervously looking around, half expecting something to emerge from the fog. The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity as daylight finally began to creep into the forest. The sun burned away the fog, and I started to calm down, convincing myself that it had all been in my head. Maybe just the wind or an animal. Then it happened again. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct. "Hey, Caleb." It was the same whisper scream as before, but this time it called my name. That was enough. I grabbed my bag and gun so fast, I accidentally left my hand radio on the seat of the stand. I clambered down the ladder, nearly slipping in my haste, and hit the ground running. I didn't stop, only slowing down to speed walk, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The walk back to the cabin felt a lot longer than a mile and a half. When I finally reached the cabin, Austin was still out hunting. I slammed the door behind me, trying to shake off the lingering fear. When Austin eventually returned, he was confused and kept asking if I had been screaming into the radio. I explained my experience, telling him there was no way it was me. His radio had been clipped to his belt the entire time, but as we were standing there talking about what happened, his radio suddenly emitted a strange, incoherent, screeching sound. It wasn't the usual static, this sounded more organic, almost like an animal. We listened in silence, sitting the radio beside us for the rest of the day, but the sound never came back. Later that week, we returned with Cody, hoping to make sense of what had happened. I searched for my lost hand radio in the stand and on the ground around it, but it was nowhere to be found. Needless to say, we never hunted in that spot again. In fact, we stopped hunting in that direction entirely, past the gate. To this day, it remains the strangest, most unexplainable experience of my life. See you guys in the new video. Take care, and bye-bye.